remember the exact feeling of watching the number on my phone screen go down. $248,000. $230,000. $211,400. And I didn't move. I was sitting in my car in the parking lot of a Panera Bread on a Tuesday afternoon in February, and my hands were completely still. No shaking, no panic. My phone was getting warm against my palm, and I just watched. If you had looked through my window right then, you might have thought I was reading an email, maybe checking the weather, but I was watching my entire inheritance disappear in real time. And I was letting it happen. Here's what nobody knew. Not my brother, not his wife, not a single person in my family. The bank had already been watching for weeks. Every transaction, every access, every digital footprint. They had everything. But I'm getting way ahead of myself, because to understand why I was sitting in that parking lot on that February afternoon, completely calm while $250,000 was being transferred out of my account, you need to understand what my life looked like 8 months before that day. You need to understand who my father was, what he built over 40 years of quiet, stubborn work, and exactly how carefully certain people had been waiting for him to die. And trust me, the full picture is much worse than what you're imagining right now. Before I get into everything, if you've ever been betrayed by someone you trusted completely, someone who looked you in the eye at a funeral and still chose to do what they did, I think this story is going to hit you somewhere deep. Hit that like button if you want more stories like this, and if you're new here, stay with me, because what I'm about to share is something I've never told publicly before, and I think it's worth hearing all the way to the end. My dad's name was Raymond Earl Whitfield. He was 67 years old when he died, and he was one of those rare people who never seemed like he was trying to impress anyone, but somehow always did. He grew up in a small town in rural Ohio. His parents didn't have much of anything. He worked construction out of high school, saved every dollar he could, and somewhere in his mid-30s he started buying small rental properties. Nothing fancy, duplexes. A 4-unit in a neighborhood nobody was paying attention to yet. A house that needed work and got it, slowly, on weekends and holidays. He was patient. That was his entire strategy. He was patient in a way that most people just aren't wired to be. By the time I was in high school, my dad had 6 properties and a modest investment account he added to every single month without fail. He drove a 2009 Ford pickup until the wheels practically fell off. He brought his lunch to work in a blue cooler he'd had for 15 years. He bought his jeans at Walmart and did not care what anyone thought of that. He was also the most generous person I have ever met in my life. Not carelessly generous. He wasn't the kind of person who threw money around. But if someone he loved needed something real, not something convenient, not something they wanted, he showed up. No speech, no conditions. He just showed up and handled it, and never mentioned it again. I am Caroline, by the way, Caroline Whitfield. I'm 34, I live in Columbus, Ohio, and I work as a project manager for a mid-size logistics company. Normal life. I rent a 2-bedroom apartment. I have a cat named Hector. I go to the farmer's market on Saturday mornings when the weather cooperates. There is nothing dramatic or unusual about my day-to-day existence, which is exactly why everything that happened to me felt so completely surreal. My brother Derek is 6 years older than me. He turned 40 last year. We were never especially close, and I want to be honest about that because it matters. He left home at 19, went to school in Pittsburgh, met his wife Tanya out there, and built a separate life. He came home for holidays. He called our dad on birthdays. He did the minimum that kept everyone in the family comfortable, without requiring anyone to acknowledge there was a distance. I don't want to make Derek sound like a villain from the first sentence. That would be too easy, and honestly it wouldn't be accurate. Derek and I were simply distant, not hostile, not broken. Just 2 people who grew up in the same house and then went separate directions and filled the gap with politeness. Tanya, his wife, I'll get to her. She's going to matter a lot. My dad had a heart attack in June of last year. Out of nowhere. He'd had a physical in April. The doctor said he was in fine shape for his age. He was gardening on a Sunday afternoon, something he did every week, just him and his tomatoes and his radio, and he sat down in the grass and never got back up. My neighbor, Mrs. Dalton, was driving past and saw him. She was the one who called me. I don't fully remember the drive to the hospital. I remember the lights in the emergency room ceiling. I remember a doctor saying the words, "massive" and "immediately," in a sentence that didn't have room for good news. And I remember that by the time Derek landed in Columbus at 11:47 that night, our father had already been gone for 4 hours. We sat in the hospital parking lot for a long time. Just the two of us. Derek cried in a way I'd never seen him cry before, raw, almost childlike, the kind of grief that bypasses the part of your brain that cares about appearances, and I held it together in a way I hadn't expected, which I later realized was just shock wearing the mask of composure. We stayed at the house for 2 weeks, sorted things, called his friends, received casseroles from neighbors my dad had known for 30 years, answered the same questions over and over in a way that was somehow both exhausting and comforting. And then, about 5 days in, Derek found the will. My dad had a file cabinet in his home office, not locked. He never felt the need for that. It was just a gray 4-drawer cabinet with labeled folders: taxes, insurance, rental properties, investments, personal. Derek found the will in the personal folder. He brought it out to the kitchen table where I was sitting with a cup of coffee, and he set it down in front of me with a look on his face I couldn't immediately read. "You should see this," he said. I picked it up and read it. Dad had worked with an attorney, a man named Thomas Kessler, to put together a clear, straightforward document. The rental properties would be liquidated and the proceeds split equally between Derek and me. His savings account, approximately $340,000 at the time of his last update, would go entirely to me. I looked up at Derek. He was staring at the table. "There's a note in there too," he said, very quietly. I turned to the second page. In my dad's handwriting, careful, printed, the way he always wrote everything, was a short paragraph. He said he loved both of us equally, but that he'd watched me work hard my whole life and build something steady without ever asking for anything. He said he'd helped Derek financially over the years in ways that weren't documented anywhere, and that this was his way of balancing the scales. He said he hoped Derek would understand. I didn't know what to say. Derek pushed back from the table slowly, walked to the back door, and stood out on the porch for a long time. I could see him through the glass. He had both hands in his pockets, and he was looking out at the yard, at the garden, at the tomato cages still standing from last summer. When he came back in, he was composed, completely composed. "Well," he said, "Dad always did what he thought was right." I asked him if he was okay. He said he was fine. He said we should call Thomas Kessler first thing in the morning. We did. The estate process was going to take several months. The properties needed appraisals and listings. The savings account, which came in at $348,000 when the final numbers cleared, would transfer to me once probate was complete. Derek flew back to Pittsburgh 2 days later. He hugged me at the airport. He said to call him if I needed anything. He held the hug for a second longer than usual, and I watched him walk toward security, feeling something I couldn't name. A shift. Something small and invisible. A temperature change you can't point to but you feel in your chest. I almost talked myself out of it. Looking back, that was the first moment I should have started paying attention. But I was grieving, and grief is the world's most effective blindfold. Probate cleared 7 weeks later. Thomas Kessler called on a Thursday morning. The money transferred to my personal savings account at First National, a bank I'd had since I was 19 years old. I remember looking at my balance that afternoon and feeling something I couldn't quite name. Not joy, not relief, something closer to grief with a different shape. Every dollar in that account existed because my father didn't. I didn't touch it for 3 weeks, didn't move it, didn't make a single transaction. I was still figuring out what the right thing to do was. I thought about paying off my car, maybe starting a down payment fund for a house someday. I wanted to be careful. I wanted to honor what he'd built. Then the calls from Derek started. The first one was casual. He asked how I was doing, how work was going, normal stuff. Then, at the end, almost as an afterthought, he mentioned that he and Tanya were looking at a business opportunity, a restaurant venture, and that it would really help if they could borrow something to cover the startup costs. He said borrow. He specifically said he'd pay me back with interest. I told him I'd think about it. The second call came 9 days later. Tanya was on the phone too this time. She had this warm, careful voice, the kind that sounds specifically designed to make you feel safe and a little bit managed at the same time. She talked about how much they had loved my dad, how this venture was something he himself would have supported, how family was everything. That last part made my stomach tighten. I told them I was still thinking. The third call was Derek alone. He wasn't angry, he was better than that. But there was something underneath the surface, something controlled. He said something like, "Caroline, I think Dad would have wanted us to support each other. You know what he always said about family." And I thought, that's strange. Because what my dad actually said about family was that love doesn't mean you owe anyone anything. He said that to me when I was 18, sitting in this same kitchen, and I never forgot it. I asked Derek directly if he was in some kind of financial trouble. Long pause. "Not trouble exactly," he said. I told him I'd make a decision by the end of the month, and that I needed him to respect that. He said he would. But around that same time, about 2 weeks after the inheritance landed, I started noticing something. Something small. Almost invisible. The kind of thing most people would rationalize away. My account balance was off. Not dramatically, just slightly. I keep a running tally in my head because I always have. It's just how I'm wired, how my dad wired me, and the numbers weren't matching what I remembered. I logged into my online banking and went through my transaction history carefully, and there were 3 small transfers I did not recognize. $400 on a Tuesday, $650 on a Friday, $870 the following Monday, all going to the same external account, a number I had never seen. I sat back in my chair and stared at the screen. And then I thought something I immediately felt guilty about. Derek, I want to be honest about the mental gymnastics that happened over the next several days. Because I think almost anyone would have done the same thing. You don't want to believe it. The person who would have to be responsible for this is your brother, the person you grew up with, the person who cried like a child in a hospital parking lot beside you just months ago. So instead of calling the bank immediately, I tried to find another explanation. I went through every app on my phone that might have generated an automatic transfer. I checked every subscription service I used. I looked through my emails for any kind of confirmation notice I might have missed. Nothing. I called my bank and asked a customer service rep to walk me through those 3 transactions. She was pleasant and careful in the way that customer service reps are trained to be. She confirmed the transactions were authorized by an account holder with access to my account. She said I'd need to come into a branch to dispute them, authorized by an account holder with access to my account. I was the only account holder. I had never added anyone. I had never given anyone my login information or my card number. I went into the branch on a Saturday morning. I sat down with a young man named Brandon, who had the energy of someone who had recently started the job and was still genuinely excited to help people. I explained what I'd found. He pulled up my account, looked at his screen, and frowned slightly. Then he frowned a little deeper. He excused himself to get a manager. Looking back, I realized that moment should have told me everything. But I still thought I was dealing with something simple. A data breach, maybe. A system error. Something that had a clean, explainable solution. The branch manager came out, a woman in her 40s, composed, professional, the kind of person who has delivered difficult news enough times that she's learned to do it without telegraphing too much. She introduced herself as Patricia, sat down across from me, and asked me to confirm my identity. I did. Then she said, very carefully, that there had been some unusual activity on my account, and that their fraud team had already flagged it. Already flagged it? I said. She nodded. She said someone had accessed my account using what appeared to be a legitimately issued secondary access credential. She said their compliance system had flagged it because the access pattern was irregular, the timing, the amounts, the destination account. I asked what secondary access credential meant. She paused, chose her words. "It looks like someone may have added themselves to your account," she said. "We're looking into how that was accomplished." I drove home in a fog. I sat in my apartment. Hector jumped up onto the couch and I held him without really knowing I was doing it. Just needed something warm and alive and uncomplicated. Someone had added themselves to my account. The only person in my life who had both the motive and the opportunity, who had been with me at the bank multiple times during the estate process, was Derek. But I still could not fully let myself believe it. Not yet. I didn't call Derek. That was a conscious choice. Something stopped me. Instinct, maybe, or the memory of his face at the kitchen table reading the will, the way he looked before he put on composure like a coat. Instead, I called Thomas Kessler, my dad's estate attorney. Not because I suspected Thomas of anything. I needed someone who knew my father's financial history, someone who could help me think clearly. Thomas answered on the second ring. I explained what had happened. He was quiet for a moment. Then he asked me something I had not been prepared for at all. He said, "Caroline, did you know your brother contacted me about 6 weeks ago about a power of attorney document?" My whole body went cold. I asked him to explain. Thomas said that Derek had called his office claiming that my father had signed a secondary power of attorney document near the end of his life, one that hadn't been included in the original estate file. Thomas said he asked Derek to send a copy. Derek said he would. He never did. "Did you follow up?" I said. I sent a follow-up email. He said it turned out he'd been mistaken. Mistaken. I asked Thomas, as carefully as I could, whether a fraudulent power of attorney could theoretically be used to add someone to a bank account. Another pause, longer. "It could," he said, "if the documentation wasn't scrutinized too closely at the branch level." I spent that night at my kitchen table with a legal pad, writing everything down in a timeline. The calls asking for money, the small unauthorized transfers to an account I'd never seen. Patricia's careful language about a secondary access credential, the power of attorney inquiry Derek had raised with Thomas, and then quietly abandoned. The picture that was forming was not a picture of a desperate brother making a mistake. It was a picture of a plan, a patient, layered, deliberate plan. And then something else surfaced, a memory. My dad had mentioned once, years ago, almost casually, the way he mentioned things that bothered him, that he'd helped Derek out financially a couple of times. He never said how much. I never asked. I assumed it was a loan here, a hand up there. The kind of thing that happens in families. But now I was wondering what exactly that meant. I called Jean, my dad's oldest friend, someone who had known my father since they were both in their 20s, and who had been like an uncle to me growing up. He picked up after a few rings, and after we talked briefly about how we were both holding up, I asked him gently whether he knew anything about Derek's financial history, whether my dad had ever confided in him about that. Long silence. Jean said, "Your dad never wanted you to know about any of this." I told him to tell me anyway. What Jean told me over the next 20 minutes changed everything I thought I understood about my family. When Derek was in his early 30s, he and Tanya had been involved in a failed real estate investment venture. They'd taken out loans, brought in outside investors, including my father, and when the venture collapsed, the investors lost most of what they'd put in. My father lost somewhere around $60,000. He never told me. He never pressed Derek for repayment. He absorbed it quietly, privately, the way he absorbed most things that hurt him. But there was more. Jean said that about 3 years before my dad died, Derek had gone to him again. Said it was for a medical expense. Tanya had had a health scare, a treatment they couldn't afford. My dad wired him $18,000 without hesitation. Jean paused before his next sentence. "I never fully believed the story about Tanya being sick," he said. "I didn't say that to your father. He believed Derek. He always believed Derek." I sat with that for a long time after we hung up. Then I looked back at the pattern of transfers from my account. $400, $650, $870, small amounts, testing. The way someone tests ice before they put their full weight on it. And I thought, how long has he been building toward this? The next morning, I went back to the bank. This time, I didn't go to the service counter. I asked to speak directly with Patricia, the branch manager I'd met on Saturday. She came out quickly, took me back to a private office, and closed the door. I told her everything, the power of attorney inquiry, Jean's story, the pattern, all of it. I laid it out in the order it had happened, and I didn't leave anything out. Patricia listened without interrupting me once. When I finished, she leaned forward slightly and said, "Ms. Whitfield, I want to tell you something, and I need you to stay calm." She told me their fraud department had already opened a formal investigation. The activity on my account had triggered an automated flag because of the way the secondary access had been granted. It was done using a document their compliance team had identified as potentially forged. They had not contacted me yet, because they were still in the documentation phase. Then she said something else. She said, "We have reason to believe whoever did this is planning a much larger transaction." I looked at her. "We're talking about a transfer that would take the majority of what's in your account," she said. "Based on the pattern we're seeing, we believe it may happen within the next 2 to 3 weeks." I thought about $348,000. I thought about my dad's lunch cooler and his worn-out truck and every weekend he spent working on a house that wasn't even his own home. I thought about his handwriting on that note. "I watched you work hard your whole life." "What do I do?" I said. Patricia said, "I need you to come back tomorrow morning. There's someone I'd like you to meet." That night was one of the worst I've had in a long time. Not because I was afraid in the way you fear physical danger, but because I kept thinking about Derek at my father's funeral. The way he shook every hand in the receiving line, the things he said, the way he stood at the graveside with his hands folded in front of him, looking exactly like a son who had lost his father. How much of that had been real? Or, and this was the harder question, could both things be true? Could someone genuinely love a person and still plan to steal from their sister the moment that person was gone? I didn't know then. I'm honestly not sure I know now, but I know this. It doesn't matter, because grief doesn't justify what he did. Losing a father doesn't give you the right to steal from the person your father trusted most. I told myself that until I fell asleep. Her name was Angela Rhodes. She was the bank's senior regional fraud investigator, and she looked like someone you'd see chaperoning a school field trip. Mid-40s, soft-spoken, practical clothes, the kind of person who disappears into a room until you realize she's been quietly absorbing every detail in it. We met in a back office the next morning. Patricia was there too. Angela had a folder on the table in front of her that was noticeably thick. She shook my hand, thanked me for coming in, and slid a piece of paper across the table. It was a copy of the document that had been used to add a secondary account holder to my account, a power of attorney, typed up to look official, my father's name at the top, a signature at the bottom. "Have you seen this document before?" Angela asked. "No," I said. "Is that your father's signature?" I looked at it carefully, very carefully. It was close, closer than I would have expected. But there was something off. My dad always wrote his name in a specific way. A particular loop in the capital R of Raymond, a habit going back to how his mother taught him to write in grade school. I had seen that signature hundreds of times, on birthday cards, on checks, on the lease agreements for his properties. This one didn't have it. "I don't think so," I said. Angela nodded and made a small note. She said their document examiner had already flagged it as a probable forgery. She said the notary stamp used on the document was registered to a notary in the Pittsburgh area who had since retired and was no longer reachable. Pittsburgh, where Derek lived. Angela turned to the next page in her folder. She slid a printout toward me, my account activity, the 3 transfers I'd already found, and 5 more I hadn't seen yet. Same destination, same pattern. Small, consistent, probing. "Miss Whitfield," she said, "I want to be direct with you. We have a strong case building. But strong is different from airtight. A good defense attorney will raise questions about digital evidence, about authorization, about identity. What we don't have yet is something completely unambiguous, something where no one can stand up in a courtroom and muddy the water. She looked at me steadily. "We'd like your help to get it." I asked what that meant. She explained. Their team had traced the external account that the transfers were flowing into. It was a joint account opened recently in Pittsburgh, under Derek's name and a business entity called Whitfield Holdings LLC, incorporated 3 months after my father's death. Whitfield Holdings. He had used our family name. I had to sit with that for a moment. The deliberateness of it, forming a company, giving it a name that implied legitimacy, building a financial structure designed to make stolen money look like a business transaction. Angela said their team believed Derek and Tanya were planning a final large transfer, one large enough to take most of what was in my savings. Based on the escalating pattern, they expected it within the next 10 to 14 days. Then she slid one more document across the table. A consent form on bank letterhead. It authorized the fraud team to monitor my account in real time and to document any attempted transfer without immediately blocking it. In other words, they wanted to let it happen, fully, on record, so there would be nothing left to argue about. I picked up the pen. I noticed that my hand was completely steady. "One question first," I said. Angela nodded. "If I sign this, what happens to Derek?" She was quiet for a moment. "That will depend on what we document. But what we're building has the potential to include wire fraud, forgery of a legal instrument, identity theft, and fraudulent use of a deceased person's identity. Because your father's signature and personal information were used without authorization after his death." She paused. "This won't go away quietly." I signed the form. The next 10 days were the strangest of my life. Everything on the surface looked completely normal. I went to work, I came home, I fed Hector, I responded to emails and attended meetings, and made small talk in the break room about weekend plans I had no real intention of making. I didn't tell a single person what was happening. Not my closest friend Jess, not my coworker Marcus, not anyone. Angela had been very clear. The fewer people who knew, the lower the risk of something leaking and Derek being tipped off before they had everything they needed. But the whole time, I felt like I was living in 2 separate realities at once. The ordinary surface of my life, where I existed completely normally, and something invisible running underneath all of it, a countdown nobody else could see. Derek called me on the 7th day, Wednesday afternoon. His voice was completely relaxed. He asked about my dad's tools, whether I'd decided what to do with them, whether it made sense to donate them or sell them or keep them. I said I hadn't decided yet. He said there was no rush. Then he mentioned he was thinking about coming to Columbus in a couple of weeks for a visit. Said maybe we could go through some more of Dad's things together. That would be nice, I said. And I meant it in a strange way, because I wanted to look at him. I wanted to be in the same room with him and see whether I could still find the person I grew up with somewhere in his face. After we hung up, I called Angela. She said she already knew he'd been looking at flights. She didn't explain how she knew. I didn't ask. On the 9th day, she called me. "We're seeing movement," she said. She told me the Whitfield Holdings account had received a small test transaction earlier that afternoon, $200, originating from my account. She said it was consistent with a pattern she'd seen in similar fraud cases, a final verification before executing the large transfer. A last check to confirm the channel was still open. "We think it's going to happen within 48 hours, she said. "Go about your day, don't change anything. Everything is documented and the team is monitoring in real time." And then she said one more thing that stopped me cold. She said if at any point I felt I was in physical danger, I should call her directly, immediately. That was the first time I fully understood that what was happening had layers I hadn't completely processed yet. Because Derek was planning to be in Columbus. He was planning to be here at the same time this was happening. Was that a coincidence? I spent that night going back through every conversation we'd had since my father died, listening for what was underneath the words, and I started finding it. the careful steering every time I mentioned the inheritance. The way he'd managed my expectations several times, suggesting the estate process might get complicated. The way Tanya had started texting me out of nowhere around the time the transfers began. Sweet, friendly, nothing messages about TV shows and recipes, perfectly designed to make me feel warmth toward her, to soften me. She had been distracting me, and I had almost let it work completely. I didn't sleep much, but when I did, I dreamed about my father's garden. The call from Angela came at 2:17 in the afternoon on a Thursday. I was sitting at my desk at work, staring at a spreadsheet without actually processing a single number on it. "It's happening," she said. "Can you get to the branch in the next 20 minutes?" I told my manager I had a family emergency. I drove to the branch in 11 minutes. I'm not going to say I stopped at every stop sign. Patricia and Angela were both there when I walked in. There was also a man I hadn't met before. Tall, quiet, a plain dark suit. Angela introduced him as David, her regional supervisor. He nodded once without saying anything else, which told me everything about how seriously they were treating this. Angela pulled up her laptop and turned the screen toward me. My account balance was showing $248,000. A paycheck had come in, plus one final disbursement from the property sale. As I watched the screen, a transfer request populated, originating from my account, directed to the Whitfield Holdings LLC account in Pittsburgh. The amount was $211,400. I will remember that number for the rest of my life. Angela and David watched the screen. Patricia stood near the door. Nobody said a word. Angela had explained this to me beforehand. They would allow the transaction to initiate, to generate a complete, time-stamped, fully authenticated fraud record, and then flag it before the funds actually cleared to the external account. The transfer would go into a regulatory hold. The record would be permanent and unambiguous. So I watched the number drop. $211,400, $211,400 pending. Balance showing $36,600. And I sat completely still, because I had agreed to this. Because I had signed the form with a steady hand. Because Angela had explained that this was the cleanest possible evidence, the kind that doesn't leave room for a courtroom argument. But I want to be honest with you about what it felt like. Because even knowing the money wasn't actually going anywhere, even knowing everything was captured and documented, sitting in that room and watching those numbers drop, there was a moment where something animal and ancient in me wanted to stand up and scream. That was my father's money. Every single dollar in that account was there because of someone who drove a truck until the wheels gave out and brought his lunch to work in a blue cooler for 30 years and never once asked his children to thank him for it. And someone was transferring it away like it was a line item, like it was nothing owed. I breathed through it. Angela said quietly, "It's flagged. The hold is active. The full transaction record is locked and time-stamped." She looked at me. "Miss Whitfield, we have everything we need." And then her phone buzzed. She looked down at it. Something shifted in her face. Just slightly, just for a second, and then she controlled it. She turned the phone so I could see the screen. A message from someone on her team. Subject is in the building. Branch location, Columbus. Came in person. Derek was here, in this bank, right now. I looked at Angela. She looked at David. He gave a single small nod. They had anticipated this possibility. People who commit financial fraud sometimes come in person for the final transaction, especially when they believe they have a legitimately issued credential that gives them authorized access. They show up to make it look normal, to look like an account holder doing ordinary banking. I didn't see Derek until I stepped out of the back office into the main branch floor. He was standing at a customer service counter across the room, blue jacket, a folder of documents under his arm. He was talking to a teller with the calm, easy body language of someone who had rehearsed this moment. Someone who fully expected to walk out with something. He hadn't seen me yet. For 3 full seconds, I just stood there and watched him. And then he looked up. I have thought many times about how to describe the expression that crossed his face in that moment. It wasn't guilt, exactly. It wasn't surprise, not quite. It was something more specific than either of those, something I can only call recognition. Like a part of him had always known this was possible. Like he'd run the numbers on every scenario and always included this one. And now that it was here, there was almost something like relief in it, the exhaustion of waiting, finally over. He stood completely still. Two men in plain clothes who had been positioned near the entrance, completely unremarkable until that exact moment, moved toward him from two directions. One of them said his name quietly. Derek didn't run. He didn't argue. He didn't look at the investigators or at Angela or at anything in the room except me. He said my name, very quietly. Just Caroline. Not "I'm sorry," not an explanation, not a justification, just my name, like he was acknowledging that I was real, that I was there, that we had both arrived at this moment after everything that had brought us here. I didn't say anything back. I couldn't. Not right then. There wasn't a sentence in the English language that covered what I was feeling in that moment, so I said nothing at all, and I think that was the right choice. I've gone back over that moment in my head more times than I can count. And I always wonder, what would you have done? If it was your brother standing there, your family, someone you grew up with, would you have said something? Would you have wanted to? I genuinely want to know. Drop it in the comments, because I still wonder sometimes if the silence was the right thing. Derek was taken into custody that afternoon. No dramatic scene, no handcuffs in the middle of the lobby. He was walked out quietly through a side exit by two investigators who had coordinated with local law enforcement, who had been fully briefed on the case days before. Tanya was picked up in Pittsburgh the same afternoon. I found out later, through the legal process, that Tanya had been the one to forge the power of attorney document. She had notary industry contacts through her years in commercial real estate. She knew exactly how to format a document, what stamps looked like, what language made things appear official. The notary seal they'd used belonged to a retired woman in Pittsburgh whose credentials had been compromised without her knowledge, which added identity theft to the list of charges against them. The charges were extensive: wire fraud, forgery of a legal instrument, specifically a fraudulent power of attorney bearing my deceased father's forged signature, identity theft for using my personal banking credentials without authorization, fraudulent use of a deceased person's identity for the use of my father's name, signature, and personal information after his death. And because there was a documented pattern going back years, the district attorney pursued additional charges related to financial exploitation. Thomas Kessler became one of my most important allies through what followed. He connected me with a civil attorney who filed a separate civil suit alongside the criminal case, pursuing damages that went beyond what criminal restitution could cover. Thomas had records going back years, partial financial records from the failed real estate venture, correspondence about the $18,000 that my father had sent for Tanya's supposed medical emergency. Together, they painted a picture of something that wasn't an isolated mistake. It was a pattern. Derek and Tanya both hired attorneys and fought it. I won't pretend the legal process was quick or easy, because it wasn't. It stretched for months. There were depositions that were grueling and motions that tested my patience, and days when I was so tired of all of it that I thought about what it would have cost me to just walk away, write off the money, and try to rebuild in peace. And then I'd think about my father's handwriting on that note. I watched you work hard your whole life. And I'd get up and go to the next meeting. The criminal case concluded 11 months after that Thursday afternoon in the bank. Derek pleaded guilty to wire fraud and 2 counts of forgery. He received 3 years in federal prison and was ordered to pay full restitution. Tanya pleaded guilty separately and received 2 years, with additional years of supervised release. The civil case settled several months after that. And here is what I want you to understand about what I kept from all of this. The bank had frozen the transferred funds during the regulatory hold. Not a dollar had actually cleared to Whitfield Holdings, LLC. The full $211,400 was returned to my account. The complete $348,000 my father had spent 40 years building was intact. Not $1 gone. But here's the thing I didn't expect. The thing I want to be honest about. When the money came back, when I looked at my account balance and saw those numbers again, I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel relief, not exactly. I felt exhausted in a way that sleep doesn't fix. And I felt profoundly, specifically sad about something that couldn't be measured in dollars at all. My brother had gone to prison. Whatever our relationship had been, however quiet, however imperfect, however held together by holidays and phone calls and politeness, it was gone. The version of my family I had believed in was gone. The brother I remembered from childhood, the one who drove me to my first concert and called me when I got into college, I didn't know anymore what was real about that and what was performance. That grief was different from losing my father. My father's death was clean. It was a thing that happened to him, not a choice he made. What Derek did was a choice, made deliberately, planned carefully. And that difference matters in a way I'm still learning how to carry. It took a long time before things felt normal again. And I mean a real, honest long time. Not weeks, but months. Close to a year before I stopped waking up at 3 in the morning running through conversations, looking for warnings I should have caught earlier, wondering whether I could have done something sooner that might have changed how it ended. I got a therapist. Her name is Dr. Fowler. She's practical, direct, and not in the business of letting you stay stuck in things you've already processed. We spent a lot of sessions on grief, which surprised me because I'd thought I was done with that. But what she helped me understand was that I was grieving more than my father. I was grieving the idea of my brother. The story I had been telling myself about my family, the version of my childhood that had Derek in it as a certain kind of person, that version was gone, and that's a real loss, even when the person who caused the loss was wrong. She helped me understand something else that I've held on to. You can love someone and simultaneously recognize that they made choices that were unforgivable. Those two things can exist in the same space without either one canceling the other out. You don't have to hate Derek to know that what he did was wrong. You don't have to pretend the childhood wasn't real to accept that the adult made a devastating choice. I called Gene after the criminal verdict came in. I wanted him to know how it ended. He was quiet for a long time on the phone. Then he said something I've thought about almost every day since. He said, "Your dad used to say that you could tell a person's character not by what they did when things were going well, but by what they reached for when they were desperate." I thought about Derek reaching for a forged document, for a power of attorney with a dead man's fake signature. And I thought about what I reached for, the truth, a legal pad, a phone call to Thomas, a conversation with a fraud investigator, and a consent form, and 11 months of showing up to every single meeting, no matter how tired I was. I used part of the inheritance to pay off my car. I set aside a down payment fund. I'm actively looking at houses now, something with a yard, maybe space for a garden. My dad would have had opinions about every property I've looked at, and I find myself imagining those opinions, which is probably the healthiest thing I do. The rest of the money is in a low-cost index fund that I don't touch. Every year, on the anniversary of my dad's death, I make a donation in his name to a nonprofit that provides financial literacy education to first-generation homebuyers. It's specific, I know, but it feels like the right shape for it. It feels like something he built forward into the world instead of backward into grief. I still live in Columbus. I still go to the farmer's market on Saturday mornings. Hector is getting older, moving a little slower, and has claimed permanent residence in a patch of afternoon sunlight by the living room window. I think that is a completely reasonable life ambition, and I respect it. I am okay. Better than okay, most days. But I still drive past that Panera on my way to work sometimes. And every single time I pass that parking lot, I think about sitting in my car in February, phone warm against my palm, numbers dropping on my screen, hands completely still. And I feel something that's genuinely hard to name. It's not pride, exactly. It's not satisfaction. It's something quieter than both of those things. It's more like I showed up when it mattered. I held still when everything in me wanted to react. I trusted a process I couldn't fully control. I kept my hands steady through something that had the power to destroy me. Not just financially, but in the deeper way that betrayal destroys things, the way it rewrites what you thought was solid. My dad raised me to be patient, to build things carefully, to not give up on what was right just because doing the right thing was inconvenient or hard or took longer than you wanted it to. I think he'd say I did okay. I think he'd be proud of me. And honestly, for the first time in a long time, I'm starting to be proud of me too. If you made it all the way to the end of this story, thank you. I mean that genuinely and without exaggeration. This was not an easy thing to put into words, and the fact that you stayed with me through all of it says something about you. If any part of this felt familiar to you, the slow realization, the mental gymnastics of not wanting to believe it, the exhaustion of having to fight for something that should have just been yours, you're not alone. Trusting your instincts is never the wrong move, even when it costs you something. Drop a comment below. Tell me what moment hit the hardest for you, or tell me what you would have done differently. I genuinely read every single one. If you're new here, subscribe. New stories every week, and every single one of them is worth your time. And if you have a story of your own, one you've been carrying around for years, one you've never told anyone, I hope one day you find the courage to tell it. Take care of yourselves. I'll see you in the next one.